Korean Mafia boss was about to execute a traitor, until the traitor's daughter handed him a handmade bracelet. To understand the weight of that silence on the docks, one must understand the man holding the gun. In the jagged, neon-lit skyline of Busan, the name Jang Hyun-woo wasn't just spoken, it was feared like a natural disaster. He was known as the Iron King, a man who had climbed a mountain of broken bones to sit atop the Dragon Syndicate. His rise wasn't fueled by luck, but by a terrifying, surgical discipline. For 20 years, Hyun-woo had operated under a single, unbreakable code: loyalty is the only currency, and betrayal is a debt that must be settled in full. He had started as a nameless street enforcer, a boy who had watched his own world burn because of the mercy of others. That trauma had forged a heart of granite. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble, and he certainly didn't forgive. Those who worked for him knew that a mistake could be corrected, but a lie was a death sentence. There were stories whispered in the backrooms of Busan's dens, tales of rival bosses who begged for their lives, offering millions, only to be met with Hyun-woo's empty, calculating gaze. He had once dismantled an entire faction in a single night because one man had dared to skim off the top. To Hyun-woo, a traitor was a virus. If you didn't cut it out immediately, it would consume the whole body. His reputation was built on being unreachable. He lived in a world of sharp suits and sharper blades, where emotion was viewed as a fatal structural flaw. His lieutenants often joked that he didn't have blood in his veins, but liquid nitrogen. He had spent decades building walls around himself, ensuring that no one, no woman, no friend, no family, could ever be used as a lever against him. In the ruthless hierarchy of the Korean underworld, his zero-tolerance policy was the foundation of his empire's stability. But tonight, as the freezing rain lashed against his scarred cheek, that foundation felt a sudden, inexplicable tremor. He stood there, the apex predator of the city, looking down at Dominic Vasile, a man who had been his right hand for a decade. Dominic had been the one person who knew the rhythm of Hyun-woo's silence. And yet, even he had broken the code. Usually, the execution would have been over in seconds. A single shot, a body in the harbor, and a cold walk back to the car. But as Eliana's small, hopeful face appeared in the periphery of his vision, the Iron King found himself paralyzed by something he hadn't felt since he was a child. The plastic beads of the bracelet caught the dim light, looking like tiny, misplaced stars against the gray industrial gloom. For the first time in his legendary career, Jang Hyun-woo's steady grip wavered. The code demanded blood, but the girl's wide eyes were demanding something far more dangerous: a soul. Dominic Vasile didn't look like a traitor, he looked like a man who had already died inside long before reaching the docks. As he knelt in the oil-stained puddles, the weight of his regret was heavier than the shadow of the gun looming over him. For 10 years, he had been Hyun-woo's shadow, the silent executor of the Iron King's will. He knew better than anyone that you don't steal from the Dragon Syndicate. You don't skim the accounts. You don't lie to the man who made you. But Dominic's world hadn't collapsed because of greed, it had collapsed because of a flickering heartbeat. 6 months ago, Eliana had fainted during a school recital. The diagnosis had been a cold, clinical death sentence, a rare congenital heart defect. The surgery required a specialist in Switzerland and a sum of money that even a high-ranking lieutenant couldn't produce on a clean salary. He had gone to the banks, but a man with his professional history didn't exist on paper. He had considered asking Hyun-woo, but the Iron King's code was clear: personal problems were a distraction, and distractions made you a liability. So, Dominic had done the unthinkable. He had rerouted a shipment of industrial sensors, selling them to a middleman in Osaka and funneling the digital currency through a dozen shell accounts to pay the hospital's deposit. For a few weeks, he thought he had committed the perfect crime. He watched the color return to Eliana's cheeks, her laughter echoing through their small apartment as she sat on the floor stringing plastic beads together for her bravery bracelets. But Hyun-woo's eyes were everywhere. The discrepancy was found, the trail was followed, and the hammer fell. Now, kneeling in the rain, Dominic wasn't thinking about the money or the syndicate. He was thinking about the unfinished bracelet in Eliana's room and the fact that his death would leave her alone in a world that devoured the fatherless. He looked up at Hyun-woo, his face a mask of bruises and salt water, but he didn't beg for his life. A traitor's plea was useless. Instead, his eyes moved toward his daughter, who stood just a few feet away, holding out her gift with a terrifying, heartbreaking innocence. "I'm sorry, boss," Dominic choked out, the words barely audible over the wind. "I'd do it 1,000 times again to keep her heart beating, but I'm sorry it had to be you I betrayed." He lowered his head, accepting the ultimate price for the life he had saved. He had bought Eliana a future, but the cost was a bullet, and the man he called a brother was the one who had to deliver it. The sky over the Incheon shipyard wasn't just raining, it was morning. Thick, charcoal clouds hung low over the rusted shipping containers, swallowing the moonlight until the only thing visible was the harsh, artificial glare of the dock's floodlights. The air tasted of salt, diesel, and the metallic tang of impending violence. This was the graveyard of the Dragon Syndicate, the place where disloyalty came to be buried under layers of cold concrete and deep water. Hyun-woo stood like a statue carved from obsidian. Around him, his men formed a grim semicircle, their dark umbrellas creating a jagged silhouette against the mist. They stood in absolute silence, a testament to the ritualistic nature of the night. In the Syndicate, an execution wasn't just a punishment, it was a sermon. It was the moment the Iron King reminded the world that his law was absolute, and that the hierarchy was held together by fear as much as by gold. The rhythmic thrum-thrum of a nearby freighter's engine provided a low-frequency heartbeat to the scene. Every detail was meticulously orchestrated to drain a man of his dignity before he took his final breath. The way the light hit the puddles, the specific distance the guards kept. It was designed to make the victim feel the immense weight of the empire they had dared to wrong. Hyun-woo slowly drew his weapon, the slide of the gun racking with a crisp, mechanical clack that seemed to echo for miles in the heavy air. He stepped forward, his polished Italian leather shoes splashing into a puddle, the water rippling outward like the consequences of Dominic's choices. He reached out, his gloved hand gripping the back of Dominic's neck to steady him for the shot. It was a cold, intimate gesture, the final touch of a brother-turned-butcher. The wind picked up, whipping Hyun-woo's coat around his legs, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The lieutenants leaned in slightly, their faces masks of stone, waiting for the flash of fire that would signal the end of an era. There was no room for hesitation in this ritual. Any delay would be seen as a crack in the armor, an invitation for the next traitor to rise. But then, the heavy iron door of a nearby warehouse creaked open. The sound was high-pitched and wrong, a jagged tear in the fabric of the Syndicate's perfect, dark ceremony. A splash of color moved through the gray mist, a child's yellow raincoat. The cold ritual of the Mafia execution was suddenly invaded by a force it wasn't prepared to handle, the sound of small, running footsteps. To Eliana, the world was a collection of stories her father told her to keep the shadows at bay. She didn't see a shipyard of death or a circle of executioners, she saw a secret meeting of the businessmen. In her mind, the tall man in the sharp suit wasn't the Iron King, he was the good boss, the legendary benefactor her father whispered about whenever a new medicine arrived or the hospital bills miraculously vanished. She stepped out from behind the rusted shipping container, her yellow raincoat a defiant spark of color against the monochromatic gloom. Her father had told her to stay in the car, to wait until the important meeting was over. But she had finished it. She had finally tied the knot on the special bracelet she'd been working on for weeks. It was made of the best beads she had, the translucent blue ones that looked like the sea and the glowing green ones that shone in the dark. As she walked toward the center of the circle, the scary men in black suits stepped back, their confusion overriding their training. She saw her father kneeling, and her heart gave a little squeeze of sympathy. Poor daddy, she thought, he must be so tired from all the hard work he does for the boss. She didn't see the gun in Hyun-woo's hand, masked by the angle of his body and the heavy drapes of his overcoat. She only saw his face, the sharp scar, the tired eyes, and the way he looked like he needed a friend. She reached the center of the clearing, her small boots splashing softly in the dark water. "Excuse me, Mr. Boss," she whispered, her voice tiny but impossibly clear over the roar of the Incheon wind. Hyun-woo froze. His thumb, which had been poised to flick the safety, went rigid. He looked down, and for a second, he didn't see a threat or a witness. He saw a pair of wide, hopeful eyes that mirrored a life he had buried under 20 years of concrete. "Daddy said you helped us," she said, stretching out her small, cold hands. Between her fingers dangled the string of plastic beads, swaying gently in the gale. "He said you're the reason my heart doesn't hurt anymore. I made this for you. It's a protection charm. So you never get hurt, and you're never lonely." She stood there, brave and trembling, offering a 10-cent gift to a man who controlled billions. To Eliana, this wasn't a transaction of power, it was a simple thank you. She waited, her breath hitching in the cold air, fully expecting the good boss to take the charm and tell her father it was time to go home. The plastic beads brushed against the leather of Hyun-woo's glove, and the world around him fractured. The scent of salt and diesel evaporated, replaced by the overwhelming, phantom aroma of powdered milk and cheap jasmine soap. Suddenly, it wasn't 2026 at the Incheon docks. It was a sweltering summer evening in 1998, in a cramped apartment above a grocery store where the air conditioner hummed a broken tune. Hyun-woo felt a ghostly weight on his knee. He saw a younger version of himself, a man without a scar, without a tailored suit, and without the hollow coldness in his chest. In that memory, a little girl with the same wide, earnest eyes as Eliana was sitting on his lap. She was struggling with a pile of plastic beads, her tongue poked out in concentration as she tried to thread a needle. "For you, Appa," she had chirped, sliding a clumsy, multicolored band onto his wrist. "So you always come home to me." That was the soft version of Jang Hyun-woo that the world had killed. Weeks after that memory, a rival gang had targeted his home to send a message to the rising enforcer. He had returned to that apartment to find the beads scattered across the floor like drops of neon blood. He had spent the next 20 years convincing himself that the man who loved that little girl was a weakness that had to be incinerated. He had built his empire on the ashes of that father, believing that if he never felt anything again, he could never be hurt again. But now, the tactile reality of Eliana's bracelet was like a lightning bolt hitting a frozen lake. The ice he had carefully maintained for nearly 3 decades groaned and cracked. The Iron King looked at the bracelet, the blue for the sea, the green for the light, and realized it was the exact same pattern his own daughter had made for him. The sensory overload was agonizing. He could almost feel the phantom tug of a small hand on his sleeve, a sensation he had suppressed so deeply it had become a physical ache in his bones. He looked at Eliana, and for a terrifying second, the faces blurred. The girl from 1998 and the girl in the yellow raincoat became one single, fragile point of light in a universe of darkness. His hand, the one that had held a steady aim on 1,000 targets, began to tremble. It wasn't the weight of the gun, it was the weight of the ghost he had been running from for 28 years. The ritual of the execution was dead. The sermon of fear was silent. In the presence of a string of plastic beads, the most feared man in Korea was no longer a king, he was a father who had finally been found. The stillness at the docks was no longer the silence of respect, it was the suffocating tension of a predator sensing a fracture in the pack. To his left, Hyun-woo felt the heavy, piercing gaze of Min-jun, his second in command. Min-jun was a man forged in Hyun-woo's own image, cold, efficient, and utterly devoted to the syndicate's doctrine. He had been with the Iron King through a dozen turf wars, watching his boss pull the trigger without a blink. To Min-jun, any deviation from the code was a crack in the foundation that held their entire world together. Min-jun stepped forward, his umbrella tilting as he moved into the inner circle. He didn't look at the girl, his eyes were fixed on Hyun-woo's shaking hand. To the rest of the men, the delay was confusing, but to a man like Min-jun, it was a contagion. The air grew thick with the unspoken pressure of a dozen armed men waiting for the signal to remain loyal, or to reconsider their leadership. "The tide is coming in, boss," Min Jun said, his voice a low, raspy warning that cut through the sound of the rain. "The message needs to be sent. The men are watching." It was a subtle challenge, a reminder that the Dragon Syndicate was built on the premise that its leader was more than human, that he was a machine of absolute justice. If Hyunwoo lowered the gun for a child, he wasn't just sparing a traitor, he was admitting he could be compromised. In their world, a leader who could be moved by a bracelet was a leader who could be moved by a threat. Dominic, sensing the shift, looked up at Hyunwoo with wide, panicked eyes. He didn't fear death anymore, he feared what would happen to Eliana if Min Jun took over the execution. If Min Jun pulled the trigger, there would be no witnesses left behind. "Finish it," Min Jun whispered, his hand drifting toward his own holster as if to offer help, or to take control. "One shot. For the code." Hyunwoo felt the heat of the pistol in his hand and the freezing cold of the plastic beads against his glove. He was trapped between two lives, the Iron King who ruled through blood, and the ghost of the father who had just been resurrected. The shipyard felt like a pressure cooker, the hiss of the rain sounding like the fuse of a bomb. Every second of hesitation was a step toward a coup. He could feel the loyalty of his men fraying, the mechanical precision of the night dissolving into a chaotic, deadly uncertainty. He had to act, but as he looked at Eliana's hopeful smile, he realized that pulling the trigger wouldn't just kill Dominic, it would finally finish the job the rival gang started in 1998. It would kill the last piece of himself. The pressure from Min Jun was a physical weight, a suffocating demand for blood that resonated through the silent ranks of the syndicate. But as the metal of the gun grew heavy, Hyunwoo's eyes remained locked on the bracelet. The vibrant, cheap plastic was the only honest thing in a world of lies and shadows. He realized that for 30 years, he had been a prisoner of his own iron code, a man living in a tomb of his own making. Slowly, deliberately, Hyunwoo reached out his left hand. The movement was so unexpected that Min Jun's hand twitched toward his holster, and the guards behind him shifted in a wave of nervous energy. But Hyunwoo wasn't reaching for a blade. He took the string of beads from Eliana's tiny, cold fingers. With a grace that felt like a prayer, he slid the multicolored bracelet over his glove and onto his wrist. The contrast was jarring, the bright, childlike blue and green beads sitting against the dark, expensive fabric of a man who dealt in death. Then came the moment that would be whispered about in the gambling dens of Busan for decades. Hyunwoo's thumb moved. With a distinct, final click, he engaged the safety on his pistol. He didn't just lower the weapon, he tucked it back into his shoulder holster, burying the steel beneath his coat. The Iron King had just committed the ultimate sin, he had chosen mercy over the mandate. "Your gift is accepted," Hyunwoo said, his voice no longer a rasp of command, but a steady, grounded rumble. A collective gasp seemed to leave the men, swallowed by the wind. Min Jun stepped into Hyunwoo's personal space, his face contorted with a mixture of disbelief and fury. "Boss, you can't be serious. The debt is unpaid. If you let him walk, the Dragon Syndicate is a joke by morning." Hyunwoo turned to face his lieutenant. The scar on his cheek seemed to sharpen in the floodlights, and the calculating coldness returned to his eyes, but it was directed outward now, toward the men who demanded a murder. "The debt is not unpaid," Hyunwoo stated, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man who had found a new reason to rule. "I am the syndicate. And I have decided that this man's life belongs to me in a different way." He looked down at Dominic, who was trembling not with fear, but with the sheer, agonizing shock of survival. Hyunwoo reached down and gripped Dominic's shoulder, pulling him up from the oil-slicked ground. It wasn't the grip of an executioner, but the firm hold of a man claiming a prize. Eliana let out a small, joyous sob and threw her arms around her father's waist. Hyunwoo stood over them, a dark sentinel in the rain, wearing a child's trinket on his arm. He had made his choice. He had traded his reputation for his soul, and as he looked at the confused, dangerous faces of his men, he knew the war for his empire had just begun. Hyunwoo knew that mercy in the Busan underworld was a death sentence for everyone involved if it wasn't disguised as violence. The lieutenants were hungry for a body, and Min-jun was already looking for a reason to lead. If Dominic walked away now, the syndicate would hunt him to the ends of the earth. To save the father, the Iron King had to kill the man. Min-jun is right, Hyunwoo said, his voice turning back to ice, loud enough for every man in the circle to hear. The code must be satisfied. But no child should see the face of a traitor at the end. With a sudden, violent movement, Hyunwoo grabbed Dominic by the collar and dragged him toward the edge of the pier, where the black water of the harbor churned against the concrete. The guards tensed. Eliana let out a cry, but Min-jun stepped in her way, his cold eyes fixed on the boss. Hyunwoo shoved Dominic into the shadows of a massive shipping crane, shielding the man's body from the view of the men with his own broad frame. In the darkness, their eyes met for a final second. "Don't ever let her see you again," Hyunwoo whispered, a command that carried the weight of a life spared. "If you breathe a word of this, I will finish what I started tonight." Before Dominic could respond, Hyunwoo drew his weapon with lightning speed. Crack! The sound of the gunshot exploded through the shipyard, echoing off the metal containers like a thunderclap. A split second later, a heavy splash resonated from the darkness below the pier. The men watched as the ripples disappeared into the churning, oily tide. Hyunwoo stepped back into the light, his breathing steady, his expression unreadable. He looked at his shaking hands, then slowly wiped the rain from the barrel of his gun before holstering it. "The debt is settled," Hyunwoo announced, his gaze sweeping over his lieutenants with a terrifying intensity that dared them to question the shadows. "Dominic Vasile no longer exists. His name is stricken from the records. His face is to be forgotten." Min-jun stared at the dark water, his suspicion lingering like the smell of gunpowder in the air. But Hyunwoo walked directly up to him, the plastic beads of the bracelet clinking against his watch. The proximity was a challenge. "Do you have something to add, Min-jun? Or should we get out of the rain?" The second-in-command looked at the bracelet, then at the unwavering fire in the Iron King's eyes, and finally lowered his head. "No, boss. The code is satisfied." As the black sedans began to roar to life, Hyunwoo looked back one last time. In the distance, he saw a small yellow raincoat disappearing into the mist, led by a shadow that wasn't supposed to be there. He had staged an execution, but for the first time in 20 years, he felt like he had actually saved a life. The Iron King was still the ruler of Busan, but beneath his sleeve, the plastic beads were a secret oath he intended to keep. 10 years passed, and the legend of the Iron King only grew, though the nature of that legend had subtly shifted. Jang Hyunwoo still ruled the Busan underworld from a skyscraper of glass and steel, his power more absolute than ever. To the rival syndicates, he was a ghost who saw everything, a man who had become untouchable because he seemingly had no heart to break. But inside his private office, away from the prying eyes of lieutenants and the cold calculations of war, the most feared man in Korea lived a double life. In a quiet coastal village far from the grime of Incheon, a young woman named Eliana had just celebrated her 18th birthday. She lived a simple, beautiful life with her father, who worked as a local carpenter. They never knew why their small house had been paid for in full by an anonymous trust, or why the best heart surgeons in Asia had flown in for her follow-up appointments without ever sending a bill. They only knew that whenever trouble neared their door, a local gang trying to muscle in or a corrupt official asking too many questions, the problems vanished overnight, as if cleared away by an invisible hand. Dominic often sat on his porch, looking at the sea. He lived as a dead man, never daring to return to the city, but he understood the silent pact he had made. He had been given a second chance, not by a mobster, but by a man who had chosen to remember what it felt like to be a father. Back in Busan, Hyunwoo prepared for a meeting with a new generation of ambitious criminals. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal gray suit, ensuring his watch was perfectly positioned. But beneath the expensive fabric, tucked safely against his pulse, sat a faded string of plastic beads. The blue had turned to a pale sky color, and the glowing green had long since dimmed, but to Hyun-woo, it was more valuable than all the gold in his vaults. His lieutenants often wondered why the boss never took off that cheap piece of string, or why he had suddenly become a champion for the orphanages and hospitals of the South Side. They whispered that it was a superstition, a lucky charm that kept the bullets away. Hyun-woo let them whisper. As he stepped into the boardroom, his expression a mask of hardened stone, he felt the slight pressure of the beads against his skin. He had spent his life building an empire of fear, but he would leave behind a legacy of hidden mercy. He wasn't just a king anymore, he was a guardian. And as he looked out over the city he controlled, he knew that the greatest power he ever possessed wasn't the gun in his holster, but the simple promise he had kept to a little girl in a yellow raincoat. The Iron King had finally found peace, hidden under a sleeve of silk and a string of plastic stars.